Welcome, everybody, to the Practical Proficiency Podcast. I'm so excited to bring to you an expert in middle school Spanish, the area that certainly needs more attention than it gets. All the middle school teachers know that this is the absolute age to be at. So I'm very excited to bring to you Brooks from Sonrisas Spanish to talk to us all things middle school programs, middle school curriculums, teaching tips, and ideas. Brooks, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us a little bit more about your teaching experience and how you serve teachers now with Sonrisas? We give us the scoop.
Well, yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Devin. Really pleased to be here today talking to people about middle school Spanish. And we got our start, my wife and I. We co-created Sonrisas Spanish and we co-authored the curriculum together. We got our start in the public schools in the Austin Independent School District back in the early mid 90s. And this was a time when bilingual education, there was really a movement around that.
Mhm.
And so we got trained in to be bilingual ed teachers. And so we learned lots of methods for teaching ESL and for teaching bilingual ed. And we were in the public schools, but then one year in our local neighborhood, uh, a school approached us and asked if we would be interested in teaching some after school Spanish programs. And we said, sure, that sounds interesting. And so we did that. And we translated a lot of these ESL techniques and these bilingual ed techniques and methodologies that we had used to Spanish, essentially doing SSL, Spanish as a second language. And after a year of doing that, word got out, and we had other schools start to call us and say, hey, could you do something similar at our school? And we thought, wow, there's a market here for these classes. And so we just took a big leap. We quit our public school jobs and we started Sonrisas Spanish, where we would go into elementary schools and offer our class as an after school Spanish class. And we would go into preschools and offer our class as we usually in the preschools would teach during their day. And so, after a number of years of doing that, we realized that we had a methodology and a structure to our lessons and to the way that we were teaching. And we thought, wow, maybe there is a market for this. Maybe other teachers could benefit from using these lessons. And so we took a couple of years and we wrote all this down and we formatted it and we had a graphic designer friend help us and we first published in 2002 and we continued to be full-time teachers for many years in various situations, not only doing our own private classes, but also teaching in private schools. I was in and out of the public schools a little bit. My wife taught at the Austin Waldorf School, and that informed some of the methodologies of our curriculum as well. But really, teaching was our bread and butter for many years, and the publishing was sort of this side gig that we did that we knew we wanted to grow at some point. And so, really, around 2010, we really started focusing more on growing the curriculum, adding more levels, adding more ancillary supplemental materials for teachers, and really fleshing it out and making it a full, comprehensive curriculum for elementary Spanish. And then eventually, after doing the elementary Spanish for many years, we got to where we were doing middle school Spanish as well. But I think we're going to talk more about that in a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, so this is a really layered, rich experience that you have of moving from the program that you were working with, making it into an SSL program that more mirrors what it looks like to be in a dual language environment and using and borrowing a lot of immersion tactics for how you're teaching your very young, your littles learners that you're working with. So I'm curious to know, as especially since both of y'all have so much teaching experience, What are some of the tenets that inform the way that you would work with students of this age, and what does that look like in your curriculum? What are the big methodology pieces that you know has to be in a classroom of this age group?
Yeah, well, we know that young learners are very adept at language acquisition,
Mm,
right? And, sometimes people talk about the idea that, oh, young learners, they can just naturally absorb language. Well, it's not really that simple.
mm,
They are more adept at acquisition, but there has to be a lot of planning and intention behind that. So to answer your question, a lot of the methodologies that we used, as I said, we learned in our own education for being bilingual and ESL teachers. So things like total physical response,
yeah.
developed by James Asher. And what we know about total physical response is really we're putting the language into a physical context, which helps a learner to understand it. Asher would talk about having language body conversations. Total physical response works really well with young learners, and it can also work well for older middle school learners too. And then, of course, Dr. Stephen Krashen was a huge influence on us with his research and theories about acquisition-based learning and comprehension-based learning. Um, all of our lessons really thrive with the idea of comprehensible input and using that in each segment of the lesson so that the learner is understanding the language that they hear. You're putting it in context for them to understand it. And then the idea of getting lots of communication with that comprehensible input. And then, of course, the idea of doing play-based instruction for young learners. Um, we talk a lot about in our teacher trainings being developmentally appropriate for those young learners.
Yeah.
And one of the things that that means is that they do not need explicit grammar instruction. It's not really developmentally appropriate for them. Um, but they can gain an inherent understanding of many grammatical concepts through these other methodologies. And then, as I mentioned before, the Waldorf foreign language approach really informed some of our teaching too. What's really neat about that approach is it's less concerned with meaning, with comprehension, and it focuses more on the idea of the emotional content of the language and how, yeah, and how young learners are really able to connect to the language just through the sounds and the feeling and the emotional content of it. And we have found that that's really true with, especially with really young learners like preschool students. Um, you can do verse and rhyme and music with them and they don't really understand what they're singing, and they don't need to because they're making a connection with the language through the sounds of the language and through the beauty of the language. And it's really fun to think about that idea, I think. Just, yeah, bringing the sounds and the beauty of a language to a young learner.
That's a really valuable perspective to think about too, because we know that children under 10, even over 10, they love rhyme and they really respond to rhyme, rhythm, anything to music. And you kind of always wondered why, especially if they're able to spout out these long verses that they might not know what the words are. And on the other hand of that too, with some of the teachers that I've worked with that are in like especially like a K through 8 setting, I find on the other side that sometimes there are teachers who struggle to spend a lot of time in the target language with elementary learners because they think like, oh, they're not developmentally there yet for that. Do you ever encounter that
Yeah.
when you're working with teachers in teacher trainings of, like, well, let's just do the calendar because that's what they're ready for, and we'll sing song about the calendar.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of a daunting thing to think about staying in Spanish, staying in the target language throughout your whole lesson. In our teacher trainings, we talk about one of the best practices for the Sonrisas Spanish curriculum which is a recommendation from Actful, is to use the target language, use Spanish at least 90% of the time in your lessons. And our lessons are formatted, they're designed so that this is achievable. But we talk about taking that leap of faith and really trying to do that. And, comprehensible input helps with that. Structure helps with that. Um, and one of the things that we mentioned to teachers too is, hey, you're teaching Spanish. The best way to do that is to speak Spanish and
Surprise.
to
Yeah.
do all these different activities that you're doing in Spanish. And one of the things I wanted to touch on from your previous question too is also this idea with young learners of play-based learning
Yeah.
and just providing lots of different activities. So you're covering different modalities of learning. So, for example, with our lessons, you have music, you have role play, you have games, you have stories, authentic Spanish literature, and you have art projects, and you have drama. And so it's taking all these different activities, having comprehensible input in those different activities, and then having communication happen in all those different activities.
Mhm.
It's amazing how much ground you can cover, how much communication you can get with students through this diversity of activities, and how a lot of that becomes natural because really you're playing, you're doing all these different age appropriate activities, you're communicating in Spanish throughout, and students have that opportunity to acquire the language.
I would imagine with something that's already sounds that fun, like if you're switching activities every 15 minutes and doing something like first we're gonna like do a story tell with this cute stuffy, and then we're gonna, play dress up and somebody's going to be this character and that character that they get to focus in, the kids are focusing in on, like they have so many visuals to work with as you're talking to them in Spanish that they're not as intimidated by what you might be saying or even focused in that much on it. They're just here to play. And if you're requiring that they play in Spanish, they're going to be right there along with you.
Totally. Yeah, we talk about that all the time is, if you are in that mode, students don't really even think about that they're learning Spanish. They're
Yeah,
just having fun. They're just doing all these different activities in Spanish. Um, but again, that takes a lot of
it
intention and a lot
does.
of planning behind it. It's not like you can just go into a classroom with a group of kids and start
Mhm.
speaking Spanish and playing games. There is all that intention and planning behind it.
Yeah, and I'm sure they're going to need a lot of scaffolding too, so that it's easier for them to be with you on that.
For sure. And something you said made me think too that another big part of it, and which is a big strength of the Sonrisas Spanish curriculum, is structure.
Yeah.
Because we know young learners, especially, really thrive with structure. Essentially, what you're doing when you have a consistent structure is you are making the learner feel comfortable and feel safe in their learning environment. And we know that we want students to take risks with language, but in order to take risks, they have to feel safe.
Hmm.
And so when you provide that structure, then they feel comfortable, they feel safe, so they can take risks with the language. Um, Structure is a huge part of what we do. Our lessons are very structured. We talk about structure and consistency a lot in our teacher trainings, and we just feel that it's a really important part, especially with something like a second language class, a foreign language class, which can be really intimidating for some students. To have that structure where they feel safe and comfortable, it just is a huge benefit to their learning process.
So, with structure, does that mean to you, and when you're working with other teachers as well, I'm imagining somebody like who's in a K through 8 program, does that mean that if they maybe see their kids 3 times a week, that they're using similar classroom routines every time that they see them?
Yes, exactly. Um, all of our lessons. have the same routine, the same structure for our elementary classes. It's circle time, story time, and art time. And you do that in every class. Now, within that structure, there's a lot of diversity of activities, but you have that structure that's providing that consistency, that, structure where the student can know what to expect, feel safe, feel comfortable in their learning environment. So yeah, we do that, all of our lessons follow that. And, for some teachers who want more diversity, maybe they're a little challenged with that, but we really try and reassure them that, hey, this is something, especially with this language class that can really help.
And circle time's something that's already so familiar for
Yep.
elementary students that now you're taking something that they already know how to do, kind of like I would do in a high school classes. This is a show you've already seen. Now we're going to do it in a different language format or a different activity. So you've got circle time first, then you dive into story time, which is something that, with you could talk about forever. That's like a whole nother podcast, is the power of
Totally.
story time. But
Yeah.
would you say that with your elementary learners and your middle school learners, this is something I feel like you could especially dive deep into because they're so ready for story time and they're
Hmm.
very engaged in story time. This is like big time opportunity here to get a lot of good input.
Yeah. So we like to talk about using a method called shared reading,
Mm,
which, probably anyone out there that has ever read stories to children has done shared reading. Shared reading is really nothing more than the listener being able to hear a fluent speaker use tone and expression and inflection to bring the story to life. And shared reading is also being able to use the story to extend your interpersonal communication. Now, what I mean by that is you're never going to take the story and just read it from front to back and call it good,
yeah.
right? You're going to use that story as a tool to get more communication with your students. So you're going to pause from time to time throughout the story and ask clarifying questions about the story, ask questions about the illustrations. And this can be so effective. You can get so much more communication in. And it's also beautiful because you can differentiate your communication with learners at different levels.
Mhm.
You can ask those very beginner level students simple yes or no questions about the story or about the illustrations. Those more advanced learners, you can relate the story to their daily lives or to their home lives. So yeah, the story time part is a huge part of our lessons. And, we, the storybooks that accompany our lessons, we've chosen them based on elements that lend to that effectiveness of communication and comprehensible input. So all the storybooks in our curriculum have things like vivid illustrations that convey
Mhm.
the meaning of the text, verse that includes, I'm sorry, text that includes verse and rhyme, like we talked about earlier, text that is repetitive, and stories that have familiar themes for young learners.
Oh, I already
Yeah,
feel more relaxed just hearing that because I know that's like
nice.
a huge challenge for middle school and elementary teachers is like, I know I want to use real books, but which ones do I select? That's huge.
Yeah.
So you have this nice foundation working with young learners for elementary school. Tell us about going into middle school Spanish and this very unique group of learners that has all of these strengths. And I feel like get really misunderstood in the language teaching context. So tell us about what are some things as you were working on this middle school curriculum that you now have with Sonrisas levels 2 and 3 that cover both of those. What are some things that you noticed were some common issues with middle school Spanish, and how did you get into that realm?
Yeah. Well, through the years of, um, selling our curriculum to elementary Spanish teachers, we realized that we needed something for those upper grades
Mhm.
because Usually we found that when students got to about fifth grade or sixth grade, depending on the curricular programming at their school, and what they were used to, but generally around those grades, they would start to not connect to that mode of instruction where you were doing circle time, story time, and art time. Essentially, they think it's little kiddie stuff.
Yeah.
So they were no longer really interested in that. Um, and so we knew we needed to develop something for those older learners. It just so happens that in about 2000, when was it? 2006, I did take a high school Spanish teaching job, and first time ever teaching high school. And the teacher that was there before me had been there for 30 years, a very traditional type teacher.
Mhm.
But just in her last few years of teaching, she went and got trained in TPR storytelling. And it revolutionized her teaching after decades of teaching in a very
Wow.
traditional, direct instruction, kind of strict way. She just got opened up to this whole new way of teaching. So she recommended to me that I get trained in TPR storytelling to continue what she had been doing with those high school classes.
Mhm.
So I did. I thought it was brilliant. I loved it. I started teaching it in this high school class, worked really well. And then the light bulb kind of went off. Oh, maybe this could work well for those older elementary and those middle school students too. So then I had the opportunity to take a job with an alternative school in our district here, where we are in Southwest Colorado. I was doing elementary Spanish, but then they wanted a middle school cohort as well. They wanted to do a multi-age fifth through eighth grade class. And I thought, great, that sounds awesome. I'll do that. And so I did that. And what I did is I kind of adapted. I did more of I did the TPR storytelling, but I continued some of the things from our levels one and two curriculum, um, some of the calendar type activities. I continued doing TPR, and we continued to do role play. And anyway, it worked really well. And so then that gave us the opportunity to author some of those lessons and bring that forward for the middle school Spanish grades. And so that happened in the mid-teens, where we really, started publishing the middle school Spanish and adding that to our elementary Spanish, and really thinking about getting a full like K through 8 scope and sequence, articulated sequence for instruction for K through 8.
Oh,
Um,
the
I-
dream. So many people ask that. So that's awesome.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So with these sixth through eighth graders, what did you notice were some you talked often about with Sonrisas that the structure is really relying on routines to make kids feel safe. So what do
yes,
sixth through eighth graders need to feel safe when you're doing instruction with them?
yeah. As we know, probably your biggest issue with middle school students can be simply put as hormones,
Yeah.
right? Um, but what that means is, they're exploring, they're trying to find themselves, they're trying to become themselves. And so, really there's a lot of, uncertainty and maybe insecurity there with those learners, right? And so again, the structure can be really helpful.
Hmm.
Just to have, I think the idea of continuing that structure in middle school is really helpful for those learners. But then there's also an element where, they still want to have fun, but they're ready for a more like concrete learning style.
Oh, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and they're ready for more intellectual learning, really. Um, in those elementary grades, students aren't really learning in an intellectual style. And what I mean by that is they're not studying rules, they're not studying grammar. They don't need to. It's not really developmentally appropriate for them. But when those students get into those middle school grades, they're ready now for more of a concrete, intellectual learning the how and why of
Yeah.
some of these, if they've had instruction in Spanish through the elementary grades and they've gained an inherent understanding of a lot of grammatical concepts, well, then in those middle school grades, they can start to learn the how and why of many of these concepts that they already understand. And it's actually, we didn't really talk about this before, Devin, but I want to mention this because
Ooh.
we did develop a methodology that guides the different levels of our curriculum work. We
Oh,
call
okay.
it we call it acquire, develop, learn.
Hmm.
And each of those words corresponds directly to each level of our curriculum. So what that means is that in Sonrisas level 1, we're giving students the opportunity to naturally acquire Spanish, much as they would their first language, through all these age appropriate, fun games and activities where there's lots of opportunity for communication.
Hmm.
Then in Sonrisas level 2, we take that acquired language and we develop it. We develop it by adding more complex performance targets to the lessons and by adding a partner time segment to the lessons where students begin to interact in a peer-to-peer mode. And with levels 1 and 2, there's no explicit instruction in grammar. As I've said, it's not really developmentally appropriate.
Hmm.
So it's not until Sonrisa's level 3 that we weave in explicit grammar instructions so students now begin to learn the how and why of many of these concepts that they already understand from levels 1 and 2.
Hmm.
So acquire, develop, learn. That's the sequence, that's the progression through our whole curriculum that really guides the way that the different levels work together.
Hmm. And for that age group, for sixth to eighth graders, depending on what the school looks like, they're curious. They're ready to ask
Yes.
about like, why does it look like that? I've been seeing it like that, and now they're ready to explore a little bit of what that development could look like for them. So
Hmm.
with that in mind, what are some of the routines that I know you mentioned that they start getting into to peer-to-peer mode and partner time. So tell us a little bit more. I'm curious about what these routines look like in the level 2 and then to the level 3. What are the classic routines that you're training teachers on for that age group?
Yeah. Well, the level 2 continues with that same structure from level 1 with the circle time, story time, and art time,
Hmm.
with the addition of partner time.
Okay.
Yeah. And then level 3 is completely different in structure. No more circle time, story time, art time. As I said before, with those older students, they start to think that's little kitty stuff.
Right.
So instead of that, the lessons are organized into thematic units.
Mm.
Yeah, and every unit has 10 lessons. And so part of the structure is in each unit, those 10 lessons always follow the same sequence. So the students become comfortable with this sequence of lessons in each unit. And what that sequence is that in the first lesson of every unit, we introduce a cultural theme. There's a cultural reading that students can either do individually or the teacher can do as a whole group. And then there are guiding questions for the teacher to have a discussion about that cultural theme. So we put the culture right out in front at the beginning of the unit. Then in lesson 2 of each unit, the teacher teaches a grammar concept. And this is much more of an old school direct instructional style. She's in English, teaches the grammar, and then the students get the opportunity to practice it in a grammar exercise. But then in lessons 3 through 8, the majority of each unit, the students can use the grammar because it's woven into a TPR story. And so for lessons 3 through 8, we use the TPR storytelling method to not only have the students be able to use the grammar, but also learn more vocabulary and phrases and build their comprehension and build their speaking skills. I don't know how much your listeners are familiar with TPR storytelling, but it's just so effective for that middle school group because number one, it's super fun. Number two, it's really engaging because the students are coming up with the details to the story. So they start to take ownership of the story. So they get really engaged with this. They love it. They're like, "Oh, wow, this is our story." And then number three, um, it's really good for retention of vocabulary and phrases and concepts because it's their story, and because you have a way when you do this method of really trying to um, latch on to the most sort of bizarre and funny details that are done in the story. The students love that. And so you can get these crazy stories going. They just think it's so funny. And again, it's almost like they're back in that play mode. They're playing with the language in this storytelling experience. They're creating these details. They're taking ownership of it. Um, and I can't remember what your question was and if I answered it.
Yeah, that's it. Routines about
Yeah.
what middle schoolers really respond well to, and you really
Okay.
hit it on the head there with they're responding well to ways to engage and interact with language that's really fun and gets to bring out, the stuff that they love about class, which is making
Yeah.
jokes and being the center of attention.
Yeah, and I think you were asking me too about how, how is their structure in these level three
Hmm.
lessons. So again, it's the units, it's the lessons in the unit following the same sequence. When they're done with the TPR story, in lesson 9 of each unit, the teacher teaches a communication strategy, which these are things that help students bridge the gap between language and culture.
Hmm.
Um, Things like getting meaning from context, cognates,
Hmm.
all of that kind of stuff. And then in lesson 10 of each unit, everything comes together in both a whole group reading activity and a partner time activity. And then all of the lessons also have an introduction section where the teacher can do an optional calendar routine. There's traditional TPR to warm up students, and there's a spelling activity too. And I have to say something about this spelling activity because it's so funny to me, but students love to like try and spell words in Spanish. I mean, it sounds funny, but
Hilarious.
we just always incorporated this into it was really my wife that discovered this where she started doing a spelling activity with her middle school students. And she's like, I can't believe it. They love it. We turn it into a little competition, see who can spell the word the fastest. They do it on, whiteboards and then they hold it up for me. And I think it's just sort of like the novelty of trying to spell in a different language, but it's a great way to create phonic awareness, and to create awareness of um, the alphabet and spelling and pronunciation. So that's part of the introduction to those level 3 lessons as well. So again, back to your question, it's structured throughout the whole unit, and that's the way each unit works. Each unit follows that same sequence with the lessons. And again, it's about giving students that familiarity with the content, with the sequence, and with the structure. I'm just a big fan. And I think, I have to mention too that it's helpful for teachers as well,
Hmm.
because you're not trying to reinvent the wheel each unit and each lesson. You get accustomed to this sequence as well, and you start to get your rhythm with it, and you start to get your, confidence with it. And so it's a good thing for teachers too to have all that structure.
Yeah, because you're providing all of the materials that they don't have to come up with themselves and the routines to follow so that they have the freedom of mind to be creative when they want to.
Totally.
And there's so
Yeah,
much creativity. Many teachers are very creative and enjoy that aspect of it, but like there's so much on the fly stuff that happens with TPR. But with it, when you have a structure in place of these are the terms I want to use, it's not that scary blank slate of, oh my God, what am I doing today? It's these are the things that we want to talk about. These are the terms that we're going to make our story about. And now the kids get to run away with it and be totally creative with it. And then you have too this nice circling back, bringing it all together consolidation moment with what they do at the end of the routine with having a communicative activity that pairs it. So it's a nice transition where you don't have to think about how am I going to put all of this material together and have it make sense. which is really
Yeah.
nice to think about.
Have you, sorry to interrupt, but have you done TPR storytelling as well?
I
Yeah.
have a little bit. I used to do it with high schoolers, and I found
Mhm.
that, and I was doing it with zero training, so I was really just like flying with it to see how it would go. I found with my high schoolers that it's definitely something that I needed more training with to make it work because that's how I felt. Is almost every lesson I was going up and thinking of like, wow, I have to think of a lot of things right now. I have to come up with a lot of these ideas myself before you can get into the fun part of creativity and student participation. Is like you
Yes.
said earlier, there's a huge intentionality and planning piece to it that in order to make it fun for the students and to get that buy-in, you need to have that solidarity, that spend all that creative thinking, that brain time as a teacher. You want to spend it on the actual creation of the story rather than like setting it up, which
Yeah.
can be difficult. So I have a question too that goes along with when you work with teachers adopting this curriculum, you provide a lot of training for them, which is huge. So I want to know what are some of the common things that you find that almost that you would say you prioritize when working with middle school teachers? Like, what are the things that you know, like, oh, we're definitely going to be training on this, this, and this?
Yeah. Well, specifically to our lessons, to the Sonrisas level 3 lessons, we want to make sure that they really understand the TPR storytelling method
Yeah.
because it is challenging. And as you just alluded to, it does take practice. To that end, we have training videos that are included with the curriculum, but then we also offer targeted um, individual training if necessary, because it just is much more effective when you go into it, having a little practice and knowing how you're going to do it. Um, you had mentioned, trying to come up with the story on your own.
Mm.
That's not something that teachers have to do. We script in our lesson plans, we script out the story for the teacher. What's missing are those details that the students are going to provide for you. Um, but yeah, we really try and focus a lot on that, but then also, making sure that teachers understand that sequence of lessons and how they can um, help their students to feel comfortable with the different, there's direct instruction, then there's the TPR storytelling, there's the culture, all these different elements of it. Really, it's like a blended approach, which
Mhm.
works really well in that middle school grade level because as you know, in middle school, you have some students that they still are connected to that younger mode of, learning. And
Mhm.
then you have others that are ready to move on. Um, Another thing that we've done with a lot of the lessons, or rather with a lot of our classes, is once you're done with the TPR story, if you want, you can have students act it out. Or nowadays, you can have them make like a video of it or a movie of it. And they just love that. They love doing that. So that's another thing that we talk to teachers about too, like how you can extend the learning by, not just doing the story, but then letting the students take the wheel and say, hey, if you want, you can create a play out of this, or you can create a movie, a video out of this. And most of the time they do want,
Oh
they
yeah.
want to do that. Yeah.
Talk about like
Yeah.
huge community building and ownership, all the things that you're looking for.
Yeah. And integration of language.
Hmm.
When they have to take the language that they've learned and then integrate it into, performance, that's really strong learning that they have to do. That's, synthesis and creation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would like to know as well with with how you designed this program for with level three for this age group. There can be some big frustration with big publishers who are serving the same age group that I know that a lot of teachers who are middle school teachers listening to this can relate to. So What are they? How are they causing problems? And what are some of the ways that we can move away from that?
Yeah, I think, for me, when I started teaching high school Spanish and then thinking about doing middle school Spanish with the big publishers, what was most frustrating was just, it was almost like they were trying to do too much,
Mm.
which sounds weird because, as teachers, we always, we're always looking for more materials, more content. But I mean almost more specifically, like the way the lessons are presented. You get this, big hardcover book, looks great. It's got all these different elements. It's got, maybe there's an audio element, there's a video element, there's an online element. Um, but like when you're looking at the lesson plan in the book, there's also like all this sidebar material, or
Mhm.
there's material at the bottom. After you do number three in this part, go to this, section and do this. And just for me personally, it was always kind of like, wow, I don't even know where to start. Like, it seems like just like too much. And I think a lot of teachers have had the experience where they get one of these curriculum from a big publisher and it's got all these different components to it, and they end up doing like one or two components, right?
Yeah.
They just take the thing that like makes sense to them or feels comfortable and they just do that. And so it's kind of like really sort of, inefficient and wasted material. So when we started thinking about, creating our materials for teachers, we were like, we just want this to be really user friendly,
Mhm.
a really simple presentation, and that structure and that consistency was a big part of it. Like, do something where as they move through the lessons, they start to get a rhythm and they start to know what to expect and what to do. And so then within that, they can use, as you were alluding to earlier, they can use their creativity and use, you know, whatever to make their learning fun and for students.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Because it's a when you're comparing the two approaches, the this approach here is a very dialed in approach where there's opportunity for exploration and play because you know what's coming and you know you don't have to provide those materials here. Whereas looking at because I know what you mean when you're looking at my first experience with teaching was the middle school classroom that I was in for my student teaching class. And it's you get a big textbook that has all of these options for you, and it's also like this dual anxiety of, well, I'm never going to get to cover all of this. So am I actually teaching the material as well as this somehow feels like it's for high schoolers because they're moving at this pace and doing so much direct instruction, like more direct instruction than anybody should ever do ever. And
Right.
there's not enough of that cultural element or that play element where middle schoolers are that beautiful in between where they're exploring what it means to be an adult learner, but they're still kids and they're in
Yeah,
between that stage. And so you need both.
I agree. Yeah, you really do.
Yeah. So with that in mind, too, this approach is a very blended approach of making sure that middle schoolers get exactly what their need here. So I'm really excited about this whole idea of having like a K through 8 full scope and sequence where students get to go through the entire like the full spiral program of the acquisition and then development and then learning. So tell us more about what this looks like with this blended approach in level 3. What are some of the elements in there and how does it serve the students that you're working with?
Yeah. So what I mean when I talk about a blended approach for middle school Spanish is the idea of, with our elementary lessons, it's much more of an immersion, acquisition, communication based mode. But then with our Sonrisas level 3, for those older students, as I mentioned before, who are now ready for some more concrete and intellectual learning, because you're going to have those students that they want to learn by learning the rules and
Hmm.
learning the grammar and doing some practice with that. But you're going to have other learners that are still ready to just like immerse themselves and be in that acquisition and communication mode. So we thought, let's hit both of those.
Hmm.
And so, with the cultural parts of the lessons, that especially something that we have always felt can more easily be taught in English simply because the language that you need to use to discuss culture and to compare and contrast cultural practices and products, it's just easier in English. So that part, is in English. And then the grammar instruction that occurs, as I said before, this is much more of a direct instructional style. You're teaching the grammar, you're teaching the rules, you're going over it, and then students get to practice it. But then you bring in, if you want to do the, as I said before, the calendar routine, that's still going to be in an immersion mode. The TPR is a warm up for each lesson. That's back to your, acquisition, immersion type learning. And then the TPR storytelling, that is meant to be more in that immersion mode as well. But again, with the TPR storytelling, you know, a frequent question I get from teachers about our level three is, well, can I use it with just beginner students? If they
Mm.
haven't had any Spanish in the elementary grades, shouldn't I be teaching them Sonrisas level one? And I said, well, no, you don't really want to do that because the mode of instruction isn't really designed for those older learners.
Mhm.
The answer is that yes, total beginner learners can use Sonrisa's level three. The reason is because you have this blended approach. Some of it is in English, but then the part that is not, the TPR storytelling, as you probably know from having done it, part of the method is that you pre-teach all of the vocabulary
Mhm.
and you write the vocabulary on the board. The students write the vocabulary in their notebooks. So they are working with vocabulary and phrases that they understand or that they can refer to. And so that's really helpful. Um, the TPR storytelling is just so effective at building that comprehension, building those speaking skills, and really helping students gain an ear for what sounds correct in Spanish. Um, and then at the end of the unit, you have more comprehension acquisition type learning with the whole group reading, which is in Spanish. It's la lectura. That's part of lesson 10 of every unit. And then the partner time activity, that is students are back in the peer-to-peer mode, interacting in an interpersonal mode of communication to complete some task. And then many of the partner time activities have a presentational component to them as well. So with those partner time activities, we're getting the three modes of communication in with students in that peer-to-peer mode where they're doing the interpretive mode, the interpersonal mode, and the presentational mode. Um, you know, a lot of the lessons in the curriculum that we developed came not only directly out of our own teaching, but directly out of our own experience of learning language.
Mm.
And for me as a language learner, I did really well with rules and with grammar and with being able to take those and then translate them in and use them in a communicative mode. And so it just made me think, there are learners like me out there that don't want to always be in that immersion mode. So let's give them a blend. And so bringing it back around to your question, that's why we thought this blended approach would be really good for middle school Spanish and for our level three curriculum.
This is something I think the world language community could do a lot better with, is this understanding that there are learners with different needs, and yes, research first, but also teachers who are functioning in a rigidity model of either like entirely immersion or entirely direct instruction. Like rigidity in nature often means that you die as soon as things get hard, like the if you're really a rigid style, it's not going to work with the ever dynamic and fluid nature of teaching, as well as the different students that you're going to have in your room. So, something that we've seen in the proficiency world in the CI space is that as it's becoming more popular, people get really excited about, like, well, this is the only way, and the only way that I'm going to do things is entirely in this manner or entirely input driven, where you're going to need to hit on all the different elements to hit all your different students exactly where they're at. And it feels to me like, with my very limited experience with middle school, you're going to have to elaborate on this, that you're going to get the whole kit and caboodle with ages 6 through 8. Like, students change every day as they're in the
Yeah.
classroom and need different things. There's going to be days where they're going to hound you all day long on, like, why does the verb do that? And there's going to be other days where they don't care at all and all they want to do is play. And there's going to also be days where they want to listen to a story and interact with you and ask you a lot of ridiculous questions about your personal life. And then the next day they're not going to care at all, like they
Yeah.
change so often that you need something that's going to serve all different levels of where they're at, and rigidity is just not going to work in there. So, with your experience with teaching middle school and then developing this curriculum for middle school kids, what do you think is one of the most important thing that you would ask middle school teachers to be doing in their classrooms?
Hmm. Good question.
I know, I gave you this one on
Um,
the fly. This is a surprise one, but I've been thinking about it. Like, there's a lot of key points to take away from this, but middle school really is its own special deal.
yeah. Well, so your question is, what would you be asking middle school teachers to do? Well, I think, um, piggybacking on what you just said, one of the things is just being open, right? Being open to exploring different ways to teach and exploring different ways to have your students interact with the language. Um, and just being open to trying different methodologies.
Mhm.
Um, you know, TPR storytelling, I don't really have a good feel for how people feel about it in the larger, world language teaching community.
It's still very
Um,
popular.
yeah, I think so. I think some people maybe think it's kind of fringe or something, or that it's just too unorthodox. For me, again, going back to just my own experience, I like things that work. I like things that I see results with. I like things that I see students connecting with. And when I first got that training in TPR storytelling and I started using it with students, and I saw the reaction, I saw the connection, I saw the learning that occurred. I still have students coming back to me now, from when I was teaching in 2006 that say, "Oh, remember that story we did in Spanish class?" Or they remember their Spanish name, or whatever.
Mhm.
Anyway, I like things that work. So that's why we designed our lessons with that component in it, but also putting in those other, direct instructional things for the grammar and for the culture and for the communication strategies.
Mhm.
Um, but also adding those other elements in the introductory part of each lesson where you can do calendar time, you can do TPR, you can do spelling. And just having teachers be able to have those options to see what works with their students, because it's going to be different with every class, as you said. Yeah, those kids, those kids are haywire, and so they're different every day. Um, so the real answer to your question, I think, is just teachers being open. Whoops, open to trying different things, and but it can be really helpful to have this structure, have things sort of done for you that also offer different ways that you can take your class.
Yeah.
I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure if I
Definitely,
did.
because if you're approaching class with a plan and you have a structure, but you're also open to where that structure will take you, it allows your students to be more themselves. And I think it allows teachers to be more themselves too, without having to spend a lot of extra brain power on coming up with a lot of material or best ways to approach what a seventh grader needs in the middle of
Yeah,
February. Like, you've got that covered for them. So
I want to add one other thing to
do,
my
do.
answer. Yeah, and that is, Also being really honest with students. And I think with middle school, you don't really have to do this with younger learners, but I think with middle school students, being really honest with them about the idea of taking risks with the language and how your classroom is a safe space to do that. And that if somebody messes up, we're not going to make fun of them.
Mhm.
And being honest with them about your own learning, saying, "Hey, I haven't always been fluent in Spanish. I had to learn too, and I used to mess up all the time. And
Mhm.
when I first went to the first Spanish speaking country I visited, I felt like I didn't know anything. And
Mhm.
it was so hard to talk. And by the end of the day, I was exhausted just trying to think of what I was going to say just to buy a loaf of bread or whatever that is. And, telling them about that and saying, hey, we're going to have fun. Learning language is fun. You have to take risks and, helping them to understand it. And I think when you do that and when you set expectations around that, it sort of opens them up because the rest of their middle school experience, right? They're all so on edge.
Yeah.
They feel like they're getting judged. Um, they're maybe judging themselves,
Yeah.
and
Invisible audience is so real. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so, it's trying to create this environment where, hey, this is something totally different from your math class and from your science class.
Mhm.
This is language. We're going to have fun, and language is fun. And you're going to be opening yourself up to a whole new world. If you can speak another language, you can make different kinds of friends, you can communicate with people all over the world, et cetera, et cetera. And so, being open and honest about that and having those conversations with them.
Yeah, because they
Yeah.
know you're not, and they're very sharp. They're very very smart. That's a really good reminder for all of us. All right, so my last question for you then is, knowing what we know now about how you can best support middle school students, how can teachers connect with Sonrisas and find out more about how to use this in their program?
Yeah. Well, the best thing is to, initially visit our website, sonrisasspanish.com. Um, there's lots of, information there. Our blog is great. If you want to go on our blog, you can do a search for middle school Spanish. You can do a search for comprehensible input. You can do a search for TPR storytelling. We've got tons of content there, lots of useful, practical articles for teachers. But also on our website, if you're interested in the curriculum, you can request a free sample from us. There are big buttons on almost every page where you can request a free sample. And once you do that, we'll get you some sample materials. For our level 3 curriculum, we actually offer a full unit. So we can send you out the introduction section to the teacher manual that will explain how you teach the unit, but then we'll give you a full unit of our level 3 curriculum, and you can take that and try it with any class.
Fully set. That's exciting. So
Yeah,
go check it out. All of the information will be below this video too, where you'll be able to see exactly where those links are, and you can go see those pretty shiny buttons for yourself. Thank you so much, Brooks, for sharing with us and illuminating a lot of important topics about this often overlooked age group, especially for programs that are searching for information on K through 8 because they do it all. Y'all are amazing. I'm so happy to be able to bring this to teachers, all this useful info that they can better get to know their students and work with them exactly where they're at. That's developmentally appropriate and really fun. I want to do art in Spanish class. That sounds great. So thank you.
yeah, you're welcome, Devin. Thank you for having me. This is really fun. Um, as you can see, I'm really passionate about language learning. It's been my whole career, and it really is a joy to see children learn language.
Mhm.
I mean, that's why we all do it, right? When you see that light bulb go off, or when they say something for the first time and really communicate with you, it's just like, yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So
yeah, thanks for having me, and great to talk to everybody out there in the podcastosphere.
I
Is
know,
that a
right?
word?
Yeah. Hear it echo into the void, and then all of a sudden people respond back. It's a crazy thing. So thank you for
Nice.
being a part of it.
Okay. You're welcome.
Bye for now.
Adios.